For our next talk, it's something that I'm very looking forward to seeing. لأن it's all about storytelling through technology, which is something that I had to deal with to get to where I am today. I do dubbing, and I do a lot of cartoons. I do a lot of 3D work for fun. Of course, I'm not a professional. And that's the way I got all my stories out, whether they're social, whether they're just for fun and comedy, whether I'm making fun of, I don't know, society or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone knows my story. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce Mayor Abdalla. Yes? Come in. And I love the fact that this is what you do, by the way.
Thanks.
So I was just telling Foz, وناسا ما عندنا ناس يستعملون تكنولوجيا علشان يقولون القصص وما عندنا, we don't have this enough in our region, let alone بس بالكويت. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say to us today.
Thanks very much. Okay, so my name's May Abdalla, and just clearing up, my family from Egypt, but I was born in the UK, and 7 years ago I started a company called Anagram, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I started Anagram, and then we have the luxury of kind of 45 minutes together, so I'm going to go into a bit of detail into some of the actual projects, because the kind of stuff I like to do is stuff that's hard to explain in words. It's kind of about experience, so it takes a little bit of a time to kind of to get your head around it. Is my mic okay? Okay. So my background, before I started Anagram, I worked in documentary films for 10 years. And what I was excited about trying to do was using technology to make stories which people had to feel. So the kind of challenge, and the reason I got into documentaries and news and journalism was the challenge of trying to get people to see different sides of the story. And that's something, you know, as a Arab woman in Europe, was something that, like, there were so many conversations that you kind of realized that there are just barriers between people. So that was kind of like, that is my raison d'etre in terms of why I want to make things and what I'm trying to do. And so the question that I was trying to answer was, instead of watching a film or reading an article, is there a way that you could do physical experience, you'd have to do something that would be a medium that you could also use? So for me, thinking about technology, although we will get to the fun bits of technology in a bit, is not thinking kind of about the gadget, it's thinking about the opportunities you get with technology to make people do things, because you can do things as opposed to just look or read or watch. So the question was, is there something that happens when you have to participate, which means that you'll experience the story differently? And so that was the question. And so it kind of started, like all things do, when you don't know what's going to be, with a group of friends. And we started thinking about things that you only knew if they were going to work if you had to do them. Things that you couldn't think about in theory, but the proof was, as they say in England, the proof was in the pudding. And so here's just like a few images from like the backstage. And the really exciting thing about technology isn't necessarily the gadgets, but in terms of like coming from the world of film, there's like a very different culture in the world of technology, and that is this idea of iterating. That you try something, if it doesn't work, it's not over, you just try again. You kind of, this excitement about breaking it. And our first project, so it's me and a friend called Amy, which is why we're called Anagram, because my name and her name are anagrams of each other. That's the mystery. We decide that we have this kind of idea that it'd be interesting to do interactive storytelling, but we don't really know how we're going to do it. And we think about the feeling of not knowing what happens next. We think about what it feels like to be lost. So our first project is called Door into the Dark. And Door into the Dark, it's an immersive experience. So it takes place in a huge kind of empty space, which you enter by yourself. You're blindfolded. And you walk through the space kind of with only your hands and your feet as kind of the medium of how you know what will happen. And as you move through the space, you hear stories of people talking about their experience of being lost. So I'll just play you... No, before I play you a trailer, I'll tell you another thing. And so this is kind of like our first sketch of what Door into the Dark was. And as opposed to kind of writing what tech or what the back end was going to use, we designed a story thinking how we wanted people to feel. We were thinking about like those moments in your life where you do something for the first time, those moments that we like desperately avoid because they're horrible, or you're forced into them because of like terrifying circumstances, which means that something in our life changes and we have to confront the unknown. So really it's an experience about the unknown. And so you're listening to these stories, but it's really fundamentally what we wanted to offer people was an opportunity for them to reflect on how they, in their lives, had dealt with moments like that, to be able to have the luxury of kind of remembering it in kind of a playful way, and to maybe just momentarily shift and change how they might approach that in the future. So it was quite an ambitious target, perhaps a little arrogant. But we decided to kind of design, like you would design the story in a movie, like this dramatic arc of the character, but our character wasn't kind of in the story, our character was you, anybody who came. Could we take them on a journey where they felt fear, excitement, joy, and kind of left completely different, like they were a hero? So that was a plan. I'll play you the trailer to give you a bit of...
This is a labyrinth. For now, all you need to do is follow the rope.
When you're blind, there's no sun, except there's warmth. There's no blue sky, there's no clouds. There are no walls. There are no limits to your world. You are a body standing on something in space.
Can you feel the hairs on your cheeks? Are they wide awake?
So just a bit more explanation about what happens, because the principles of what we learnt making Door into the Dark then became like the principles which we used on all the other kind of more expensive projects that we then went on to make. So in Door into the Dark, you book your ticket, you are told that you will arrive alone 45 minutes before your scheduled slot. You get sent the exact address of the door. You come to this strange door. It's been in different places. It's been in New York, Amsterdam. But there's always quite an ordinary-looking door, kind of out of context on a street or on the top floor of a tower block. It's just a strange door. And you're told to go into the room and wait for the person who's finished, who will be finishing soon, to tell you what to do next. In this room, there's a locker, not very much, just kind of a waiting chamber. And then the person who has just finished comes out, tells you to put your shoes and your bags in the locker, gives you a helmet, you put it on, you can't see, they take your hands, they open the door and they place it on a rope. The kind of design of the internal experience is kind of these three stories. The first story is a man who talks about his experience of being blind, his loss of sight. He talks about the sense that when you're blind, you never have walls and you never have a ceiling, so you're always completely exposed, desperately waiting for the rain or something that makes you feel contained. And you begin to kind of have this sensation in your edges, in your skin, like your awareness shifts from kind of thinking to being. And this is like an interesting way of thinking about experience design. And you follow a rope, the rope continues, it's kind of a bit of a whirlwind, the music is very intense. And then at some point, the rope is suspended in midair, stops suddenly, and you're told to step forward. Yes, it's quite, I mean, clearly maybe you won't be able to handle this. But it's in that moment that it's not theoretical. It's a physical experience. It's obviously just a kind of a show. But it's a experiential metaphor for a bigger thing, that moment where you're asked to step forward and you don't know what it's going to feel like. But as you demonstrate, it's a feeling that all of us kind of know, although the reasons we felt them might be different. Various things happen. You finish the experience. You go into a room where the next person is waiting. You retrieve your things from the locker. You put their things in their place. You put the headset on them. You send them inside. You switch your phone back on, whatever. You have a moment to reflect. You open the door, and you're somewhere completely different. Unbeknownst to you, there are two separate rooms. You thought they were the same. I'm giving away the ending because I don't think we're going to build it in Kuwait. Okay. Hey, you got a fan. Okay, if it comes to Kuwait, don't tell people. And then people just kind of, they're like delirious with emotion at this point. It was like a very surprising thing to realize that we made something so naively. I guess I'm talking a little bit about this. I'm talking a little bit about starting with a very earnest intention of I wanted to talk to people about the feeling of not knowing what's happening next. We really didn't know what we were making. We continued to tell people it was a documentary for at least 2 years, thinking we'd made a documentary. Then someone said, maybe this is theater. Effectively, when we made Door into the Dark, there wasn't really the kind of the world that knew how to categorize this. This was just beginning from a intention. And I think I might be telling you a bit about this because I think in the culture of Instagram and thinking of yourself as a creative, sometimes we think about what the outcome should be and not necessarily what the impact should be. So it's worth thinking about that. So then we ended up, we were just really very surprised. We ended up winning a bunch of awards for Door into the Dark. It won the Tribeca Film Festival because they thought it was a film too. And so it really kind of validated this method of thinking about what you can do to somebody to make them feel like they're going on a journey and really putting them at the center of your storytelling. And curiously, virtual reality, and I'm going to kind of focus now more on kind of the virtual reality stuff, although technology could be many things, but VR is a particular recognizable tech that exists now. Virtual reality was kind of beginning, and people were looking for people who could tell stories from inside the experience of the person who was in the first person seat. There was a lot of very bad virtual reality was kind of happening. And so we ended up being invited to consult on lots of kind of huge projects, even though we'd never actually made anything of virtual reality before, partly because we began to get this reputation as people who could tell stories from the inside experience of a first person. And so after 3 years of consulting on other people's virtual reality projects, we decided we should make our own. And we made a piece called The Collider. And we were thinking about how to begin. What was the kind of the beginning? So if you think about what we learned from Door into the Dark was, like you demonstrated so brilliantly by your shiver, some things either make you feel a tremble or they don't. It's kind of T.S. Eliot, the poet, has a way for describing words in a poem as either quick or dead. And I kind of think of the same thing as kind of feelings. And this is kind of why Instagram is such like a unhelpful way of thinking about what we make for people, because you just don't know what it feels like to be in this room of lights. You know, it's just, is it good? Did I feel anything? And so often we feel kind of dead and numb, like what actually feels alive? And so we were thinking about virtual reality and what is kind of beyond kind of being like, ooh, I'm under the water, or like, oh, I'm on the moon, and this kind of slightly naff way of approaching immersive, this kind of new immersive scene. We're like, well, what does it really feel like to be somewhere where I can see something, but I also know that I'm also out here? Like, you always kind of felt like as we were touring, going and like trying these demos, people are like, oh my God, it's so real. You're like, yeah, it's real, but I really have not forgotten that I'm in a conference about virtual reality. And it became interesting to think a little bit about, well, what is this a metaphor for, perhaps, the fact that I'm here and I'm not here? Is there something kind of we can mine this feeling that has something more profound than pixels? Oh, no, not yet. I just talk. So there's this particular aspect of VR which got us thinking, which is often you're wearing a headset and they give you these controllers and they're like your joysticks in a game. And just by like coincidence, the first time I was demoing one of these new experiences, the controller was going to be a paintbrush. I put on the headset and I'm in the like holding screen for the game. And the man who's built the game, walks over to me and passes me this controller. And because he hasn't pressed play on the game, I just kind of see this floating thing in like CGI move towards me. He's Dutch, so it's very high. And I like reach my hand to this visual representation of a human, and I touch the controller, and then he presses play on the game. But it really stuck with me, this idea that we could, in these two separate worlds, have this moment of contact. And that was a real moment, because, there was something, it's like, this is a real thing. Could it be part of a bigger story? And so the Collider emerged. And in the Collider, it's an experience about power and relationships. It's a two-person experience. And the story is that there is this machine called the Collider, which references the Large Hadron Collider of Switzerland. For those of you who don't know it, it's like the world's largest machine. Two particles emit around this huge 70-mile cylinder underground in order to collide into each other for scientists to try and analyze what happens inside the atom. And so in this collider, this strange, fantastical machine, these scientists are trying to collide humans to try and understand what the invisible material between us that we can't see and we can barely understand is. Why sometimes do we kind of cling to each other so desperately? Why sometimes does one person get the upper hand and we don't really know why? Why sometimes do we get the upper hand? And what's our relationship with the feeling of power? So in the Collider, you begin, two people, you arrive at a machine. I don't have a picture of the exterior, so you just have to imagine. And you separately go into these two rooms, and you listen to a story, and you're asked to make a model of a moment in your life where you either felt you had power over somebody, or in the separate room, you're asked to remember a moment when someone had power over you. And here is just some of the photos of the little models that people made. So they have these few minutes alone just to reflect on a memory in their lives. This is really not very much technology here. Very sorry, Hiba. This is just kind of glue and toys. And then separately, they go into the next room, and one person finds that they will be in a virtual space, and the other person has the controllers. So the person outside looks through a gap in the door and sees... I'm not explaining this very well, sorry. So there's two people. One person goes into a room and puts on the headset. Another person goes into another room, is given some other instructions, opens a curtain and sees the other person inside. They then go in and start interacting with them. At this point, what the person with the controllers doesn't know what the person in the headset can see, and the person in the headset doesn't know that the other person is there and doesn't understand what they're doing. So there's this kind of metaphorical dance where these two people, whether they're strangers or they're really good friends, have this moment where they're like alienated from each other, but they're playing. And so this is now toured in kind of many places, and it won Best Immersive Art Piece in China. And in China, sometimes there'd be one person listening to the instructions in Mandarin and another person listening to the instructions in English, and they'd be dancing together. And the story becomes increasingly about whether they're feeling, how do they feel about being controlled, or how do they feel about being able to control someone else. And then the person on the outside discovers that there's lots of things that they could do to the person in the headset, and the person in the headset can't see what they're doing. And they're given this invitation to kind of think, like, because they have this ability to do things to the other person, do they choose to kind of play with them kindly, or do they choose to kind of trick them? Like, where's the edges of that experience? Sometimes there are these moments where strangers hug. And then, I don't have pictures of this, but once this moment inside has kind of evolved, they're asked to think about the moment that they made the model of it, the first scene, and they recreate it with each other. And this is kind of a moment where sometimes they start speaking to each other, but they speak to each other as if they're the other person in the memory. So it becomes this moment of incredible healing. And then they each leave this internal space. This is actually sand on the floor. And they go into another room where they find a menu of questions and they have a conversation about what happened. So it's quite an intense experience. It lasts for about 45 minutes. And it's very strange what has taken place because of these tools, these kind of, the way that the kind of technology affords like this kind of moment of alienation and proximity, because sometimes when we have eye contact with strangers, we can't really be ourselves. So it kind of functions like this, but it's also a bit of a playful story. And because sometimes I get asked, love has happened. There are two people in Holland who are still together because of the collider. Now for something completely different. So those two projects are quite complicated, they're difficult to explain, they cost a lot of money to build, only two people can go in every 45 minutes. It's a terrible business model. But last year the BBC asked us if we would make something to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of women in England getting the right to vote. You might have heard about the suffragettes. Last year was 2000, actually it wasn't last year, it was 2018 was the 100-year anniversary of these ladies. And they wanted something that wasn't going to only be available for people to go to for 10 days in a pop-up festival. They wanted something that would be available for people who didn't have a lot of money to kind of play. And so we took this kind of principle of, okay, well, if what we think we're trying to do is use technology to get people to do something, which is a good metaphor for how we want them to feel, what is it in virtual reality that could be useful as a kind of experience? So here we were kind of stuck, like we were given the technology first, as it were, but sometimes you do that because people are going to pay you. It's kind of, we were looking at this headset and we decided, well, if effectively so we listened to lots of amazing archive of interviews with these women, kind of in their 90s, talking about their experience. And although this picture makes them look really uncool, the more we listened to these interviews, we realized that they were just like us. They were really angry. They had it up to here, and they just did completely wild things. One woman talked about how she just walked up Oxford Street with a hammer, just smashing the windows, and then throwing rocks in Parliament. You just realize, oh my God, that's so brave. And there was something with a sense of whenever we look at these period dramas with people in funny costumes, we just think, what do they know about my life? So we thought, well, how could we just take it away from their story and make it about you? And so we made it about your voice, the feeling, which is often very hard, of speaking in public or making a really loud noise in public. So this is a film at the very kind of first test of the piece. Breath.
She could relapse at any time. Relay is strong.
I'm on borrowed time, you know what I'm saying? It's just my head's just feel good because it's, I don't normally tell people about some of this.
I also took it to my grandparents in Egypt, and they had a really nice time. So that I should show you film footage of that. So then, this is the last project I'm going to talk about, and I want to try and make sure that we have time for questions. Can I just check what time do I finish?
You'll have more than enough time for questions. I'll be telling you.
You tell me. Okay.
Yes.
So VR kind of became this thing of. It's this amazing shortcut of instead of having to spend months on building a set, which you could feel with your hands and navigate, that although it's really hard to show this in footage, this is a kind of shortcut to creating a world around somebody, and what could, there is a genuine possibility of creating this visceral feeling of, you saw those girls in there, it does feel like things are flying at your head. You know that it's animated, but they really feel like they're going to fly at your head unless you scream the words in time. And so we were asked to submit a concept for a residency at the Venice Biennale, who are now developing virtual reality alongside their film academy. And we're like, okay, I don't know if we're going to kind of make VR for the rest of our lives because, there's so many other things, but maybe we should do one last virtual reality project. And if we are going to do a virtual reality project, and there are so many subjects, what would be the best subject that would fit the medium? And particularly because, our background is in documentary, and my heart is kind of still in, what are the real stories out there, the stories that we don't often hear but have a place. We started to kind of think backwards. So this kind of aspect of VR of it feeling like you're in a real place, but you know that it's not real, whose story might fit? And then with that began this project, Goliath, which is a story of a man who has been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. It's a documentary, so he's a real person. And he spent 10 years in a psychiatric hospital in the north of England. And when he left, he was really struggling with kind of finding a place in society. There's like no community on earth that's kind of really learned how to deal with people with severe mental illness until he found like a community of gamers. I don't know how big gaming is here, but effectively John, who is this man, spends, he's now kind of quite a notorious person in the online world of games. So he spends maybe up to kind of between 6 and 9 hours a day talking with people around the world, a mixture of kind of real world chat, but also this like fantastical narrative of what they're doing together in the game. And he's seen as a bit of a hero. It's kind of, the games tend to be war hero games. They're driving their tanks. But there's this community of mostly men who are in many ways like John, a little bit excluded from society. So one of the people that he plays with is a 16-year-old boy in Detroit who is completely unable to move his body except for his thumbs. And so there's this very sweet relationship between this community who are not really in the real world, but also in a world that's kind of really meaningful, and perhaps in the future a world where we're all going to have to be a lot more. So what is there to say about Goliath? So we started working on this project, and we were very lucky to get a grant to make a prototype. But I guess my question was, having done like a bunch of things that had like won awards and felt, you know, like I was validated, I had a bit of a question which was like, what was the point of making a project, and what would be a good outcome for something beyond, you know, me feeling like some people thought I was cool. And so we started running workshops with people who had psychosis, so people diagnosed with either bipolar or schizophrenia. We started to learn quite a lot about this I forgot what the word is, this diagnosis. That there's a lot of controversy now in many countries that even schizophrenia is something that we can even talk about. And one of the things that people kept saying to us when we'd ask them, you know, if we could make a virtual reality experience that would show people what it felt like to have psychosis as like clearly as possible, who would you like to see it? And the answer was my doctor. You know, our doctors didn't really get it. They never really asked us about what the experience was. We tell them we hear voices and they would say, we're going to take more pills. And they felt like it was really crushing their experience of that reality. And the more that we looked into it, the more that we kind of found these like really shocking statistics about people with schizophrenia. They tend to have a much shorter life expectancy, like over 20 years shorter than their peer group. And this isn't a medical condition. The reason that their life expectancy is so short is basically, it's like a cumulative sense of being ignored. So every time, you know, I don't know kind of what happens in Kuwait, but there is a sense that, you know, when these people walk down the street in London, people cross the road, and the cumulative experience of people avoiding them because they kind of don't really understand what's going on in their head because they're talking to the tree or kind of seemingly erratic. There's this real sense of fear, so people tend to avoid them. So it's like, okay, well, if we could contribute to understanding that experience from the inside, this was like clearly an something that kind of affected 1 in 4 people and was something that people really didn't know what it was. Increasingly, people think of schizophrenia as like what they've seen on TV, where it's kind of serial killers and knife murderers. And but kind of in the reality, you're more likely to be attacked than you are to attack somebody if you have this diagnosis. I have time, right? Because I know I'm kind of... so in the experience, this hasn't been made yet, by the way. This is what's happening in 2020. You hear about John's story, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a second. But kind of similar to like Door into the Dark and the Collider, we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just an experience where you like listened to somebody's story and felt pity for them. Kind of it also had to happen to you. So whilst you're in the headset, there are various things that happen in the room around you. So when you come out, the room has been transformed. And for moments, you don't know kind of whether you've been imagining it or it's been real. So I can give you like a quick example of one of the things that will happen is that like when you're in this exhibition space, the person who gives you the headset and starts you on your experience, their phone will be ringing. And kind of it will feel a very natural thing. You won't know that they're an actor. Once again, you can forget this when it actually comes to Kuwait. And then during your experience, you will hear this phone ring again and you'll hear voices in the room. And kind of there'll be moments where you will be very unsure as to whether you're watching a film or people are watching you watching a film. And so what we're trying to do is also get people to, at moments, just take off the headset and kind of look and see what's going on in the room. But all of this is just binaural sound. There won't be anybody there. So just this idea of like, what does it feel to not be able to trust your own experience? So here's a little extract. Thanks very much.
So are there any questions for me? Sorry.
Like in the future, you could use everything that you're doing, not necessarily virtual reality or the door in the dark, is that what it's called? But just the ideas behind it and how that could also translate with modern day therapy, you know, and how people learn to unpack their feelings through like a physical challenge or something that's like otherworldly, where they have a chance to step outside of their bodies and kind of, you know.
It's a great question. So I think that in a weird way, like I am probably a little bit obsessed with therapy. I like therapy for people who don't want to have therapy, which is most people. And therapy is kind of like a little bit of a terrible word that nobody really wants to say. But like the thing about, I think often what people think is happening to them before, like I think the problem with therapy is that if you need therapy, you definitely don't want to have it because you don't want to go to a dark place. And so the important thing, the important thing is kind of playfulness. And there's this thing about playing and silliness that kind of in the beginning of the Collider, it's a very silly experience. It's kind of a ludicrous story about these scientists who are obsessed with material between humans. But it's kind of designing ways in which you don't really expect it, but then there are moments where you realize it is about you. And I think that the thing that I became quite aware of when I was making documentaries was that there's like two ways of thinking about documentary, right? There's a way of kind of saying like, oh, isn't it interesting that this thing has happened to these people in Africa or whatever? And there's also kind of ways of thinking about which is like, I'm looking at someone else's life experience and I'm thinking of ways in which they're dealing with this problem in a way that maybe also I might learn from that problem. And that there's like an opportunity to, you know, in a way that kind of, why do we listen to stories? Why do they kind of move us? Is there's a sense of like moving in between a person's experience just as somebody else who's away from you and also reflecting on what you do in that. So I think that when we try and design things, we try and make sure that there's space, sometimes really literally in the Collider, it's like put your memory here, or like less literally in Door into the Dark, where there is just kind of moments where nothing happens and people just begin to reflect. That there's always space for there to be a kind of parity between your story and the story of the person that you're listening to. So you might begin thinking like, oh, this is a terrible story about a man with schizophrenia, poor guy. But there's also this degree to which is like, you know, there's like an analogy in that for like how we want to maintain a sense that like we're in control of what's going on. But I'm sorry, can I keep talking to you? But like, particularly what's interesting, what's happening with this project is that we've been given a business grant to work with the NHS in England to use it as a teaching tool for medical students. So we're presenting it in South by Southwest at the medical technology stream, because it's not so much that it's therapy, it's just that there is a kind of space there for like how to invite people to challenge the way that they think about things, which isn't quite as literal as kind of therapy, which is like a very intense world, but a sense of kind of how do you try and think about something that you have a very firm idea about. How can you like loosen your edges to how you relate to something without necessarily telling somebody, okay, your ideas are wrong and these are the right ideas?
My question is, I might have missed the beginning if you've spoken about your background, but as diverse and different the projects you're working on are, how do you prepare yourself? What's the sort of thought process that comes into educating yourself basically about these different topics in order to be able to portray them in a creative way like you do? I mean, it must be a lengthy research process.
Yeah, so what my background is, and I think I'm really lucky, is that I started as a journalist, and there is a kind of naive privilege that journalists have where they feel like they can, first of all, you learn as a journalist to kind of shamelessly ask people quite intrusive questions. And you keep asking questions until someone tells you to stop asking questions. And you realize that actually most people want to talk to you about their lives. So and you know, I still remember like the very first day in my very first job ever, which was like, I was working for I was like, what do you call it, like an intern at Radio 1 and the BBC, and they told me to go on the streets of Oxford Circus and ask people something about like the royal family, and like just, you know, they call it vox pops. And I was thinking about this the other day, like how terrified I was about going up to people with a microphone and saying, I have a question to ask you, and how like actually it's this incredible thing that you learn. It's like these soft skills that we were talking about, this ability to kind of, I think it's probably a skill about knowing how to ask questions. And I think a lot of the things that make experience design or any project kind of good is kind of remembering all the things you remember when you're dealing with humans. So there's a degree to which often like there's a lot of conversations at the moment about like why there are so many women who are doing well in VR. And I have a theory about this, which is kind of, I don't know, maybe a little bit controversial, but it's this idea about kind of like women get taught quite early on in their lives how to welcome people into space. And there's a degree to which it's like you can go to these conferences and see a VR experience, and it's like 45 minutes long, and there isn't a chair, and you're just like, you know, I'm not going to really like your experience if I'm standing up, or if it's really cold in here, or if there's just no comfort, and if you want me to kind of feel and submit to something, then like, you know quite a lot about me already, like, you know I'm a person, and you know that there are things that I need. So kind of, I mean, they have this term in design, they call it human-centered design, as if it's like a really complicated thing, but it's kind of literally like if someone comes to the house, you normally like, do you want a cup of tea and would you like to sit down? Like, we do know how to do that. So there's a degree to which it's just kind of being a curious human is probably like the start. I mean, you guys know how many questions I had about Kuwait yesterday. I've been here 2 hours, and I was like, I want to know everything about the city. So yeah, and yeah, obviously. So questions, never, like, I think there's a thing where sometimes we feel a little bit too shy to ask stupid questions, and that's like another thing that you learn, like as a journalist, you kind of ask really dumb things, like, you know, how much do you get paid for that? You know, sometimes you can't assume anything. And it's a good question. And partly, you know, I'm here now in Kuwait, and I'm very interested in being here because obviously, you know, I am an Arab, and it means a lot to me. But I think that to some degree, how to put this? So I worked in TV for for like 7 or 8 years before I started my own company. And to some degree, I think that the reason I was going to start my own company was like a sense of, I don't know how you feel about this and kind of what the experience is here, because it's very particular. And there's this term of like being pigeonholed, which is almost kind of like, what I really wanted to do was just to prove myself in a kind of like, without needing to talk about my personal experience, because there is a degree to which, and it's really complicated because it's not like I don't value it when people talk from their own experience, but I think, I used to work in news and it's very male, and there was this sense of like, Oliver and James and Jim or whoever, they could like go anywhere on their journalist beat, and it'd be like, oh, May, why don't you do this thing about Hezbollah? And it's like, don't know anything about Hezbollah, but, why do I have to, not that I don't value my insight and my life experience, but it was also a very complicated time, in terms of what people wanted. If somebody was asking you to make a film about the Middle East, then you were kind of stuck in this kind of really boring universe of like talking about Islam and terrorism, which it's not like they're not interesting subjects, but it's just so far away. So I think that there's a degree to which kind of like the narrative within the UK about the Middle East was just so unimaginative and so uncreative that I like didn't really want to be involved in it. I mean, I made some films in Syria and Egypt, and then kind of after that I was like, that's it. I'm going to back away from this kind of authentic voice politics, because unless you're really in control of that, there's a risk that you get quite used by other people's agendas, because they want to be like, look, we got a brown woman to say the stuff that we want to say. But I think that now, having kind of got this far, I am very interested in thinking about how that could happen in like a real way. But I think that you have to really be in control, and I think you guys are probably really totally understand what I'm trying to get at here, which is just like, you just don't want to be part of somebody else's narrative and somebody else's funding strategy or whatever, and it's a very messy conversation, which is why I'm excited to be here and kind of be talking to Kuwaiti artists and being like, what's your kind of authentic experience in this mixed up world, by like it being us conversing with each other and kind of starting something like that then just doesn't become part of this bigger narrative. Because when it's really complicated, nobody wants to talk about it.